Imagine a company, not a normal company that sells you coffee or clothes. Imagine a company that was also a pirate crew. This was the Dutch West India Company, or the WIC. It was created in the Netherlands in 1621. On the surface, it looked like any other trading company. It had a board of directors, it had investors, it even had official paperwork. But this company had a very special, very dangerous job. Its main business was not just trading goods, it was stealing them. The WIC was a band of pirates but with a government license. They were pirates with paperwork. This might sound strange to us today. We think of pirates as outlaws. They fly the skull and crossbones. They answered to no one. But the WIC was different. It answered to the Dutch government. At the time, the Netherlands was at war with Spain. This was the 80 Years' War. The Dutch wanted their independence. And wars are very, very expensive. The government needed money. Lots of it. So, they came up with a clever and rather ruthless plan. They would let a company attack their enemies at sea. The WIC was born from this idea. It was a weapon of war, disguised as a business. So, while one hand of the company was busy trying to trade for sugar, tobacco, and gold, the other hand was holding a sword. The WIC built forts and trading posts in the Americas and Africa. They were trying to build a business empire. But their biggest profits came from violence. Their ships were not just cargo vessels, they were warships. They were filled with cannons and tough sailors. Their mission was to hunt down the ships of their enemies, especially the Spanish. Spain was bringing incredible riches back from its colonies. The WIC wanted a piece of that treasure. They were ready to fight for it. The whole setup was a brilliant piece of state-sponsored mischief. The WIC was essentially a giant, publicly traded pirate syndicate. Its shareholders weren't just investing in trade routes, they were betting on battles. They hoped for huge returns from captured treasure. This made the company incredibly aggressive. It had to be. Its survival depended on finding and seizing enemy ships. This was not just business, it was a high-stakes adventure on the high seas. The men who sailed for the WIC were traders, soldiers and pirates, all rolled into one, and they were about to make history. How could a company get away with piracy? The answer is a special piece of paper. It was called a letter of marque. This was a license from the government. It gave a private ship the right to attack and capture enemy vessels. This turned a pirate into something else. It turned them into a privateer. It was legal piracy. The Dutch government gave the WIC the power to act as its navy in the Atlantic. This was a fantastic deal for the government. They didn't have to pay for all the ships and sailors themselves. The company did. It was a way to fight a war on the cheap. The business model was simple but very risky. The WIC would spend a fortune outfitting its fleets. They needed strong ships, lots of cannons, and hundreds of crew members. These fleets would then sail to the Caribbean and the coast of South America. Their job was to patrol the shipping lanes. They were looking for one thing: Spanish ships. Particularly, they hunted for the Spanish treasure fleet. This was a convoy of ships that carried all the gold and silver from the mines of Mexico and Peru back to Spain. It was the ultimate prize. Capturing it would be like winning the lottery. Of course, the Spanish knew their ships were a target. Their treasure fleets were heavily guarded by warships, called galleons. These were floating fortresses. Attacking them was incredibly dangerous. A battle could last for hours or even days. Ships could be sunk. Men would die. But the potential reward was enormous. A single captured ship could be worth more than a whole year of normal trade. For the WIC and its investors, this was a gamble they were willing to take. The promise of Spanish silver was just too tempting to ignore. This system turned the Atlantic into a battlefield. The WIC wasn't the only group of privateers. The English and the French were doing it too. Everyone wanted to get rich by stealing from the Spanish. The sea became a place of constant conflict. A ship leaving port never knew if it would reach its destination. It might be attacked by pirates or by privateers from an enemy nation. For the sailors of the WIC, every day was a risk, but it was also a chance for adventure and riches. They were part of a grand, violent, and sometimes very profitable game. Every great story needs a hero, and for the Dutch West India Company, that hero was a man named Piet Hein. He was not your typical company man. He was a sailor's sailor. He was tough, experienced, and he knew the sea like the back of his hand. Hein had a personal reason to hate the Spanish. As a young man, he had been captured by them. He was forced to work as a galley slave, rowing their ships. He spent years in captivity before he was freed. This experience left him with a burning desire for revenge. He was the perfect man to lead the WIC's fight against Spain. Piet Hein was born in 1577 in a small Dutch town. He went to sea at a young age, like many boys at the time. His early life was full of hardship, but it also made him strong and determined. When the WIC was formed, Hein was one of the first people they hired. He quickly rose through the ranks. He became an admiral. He was known for being a clever and daring commander. He was not afraid to take risks, and he was very, very good at capturing ships. He led several successful raids against the Portuguese in Brazil, who were allied with Spain at the time. But Hein was dreaming of something bigger. He wanted to capture the Spanish treasure fleet. This was the most audacious goal a privateer could have. It was something many had tried, but no one had ever succeeded. The treasure fleet was the lifeblood of the Spanish Empire. Its capture would not only make the WIC rich, it would be a huge blow to Spain's war effort. It would be a national triumph for the Dutch. For Hein, it would be the ultimate revenge. He spent years planning and preparing for this one massive heist. By 1628, the WIC was in trouble. Their early ventures had been expensive. They had spent a lot of money on ships and soldiers, but they hadn't made a big profit yet. The company was close to going bankrupt. The investors were getting nervous. The directors of the company knew they needed a big win, and they needed it soon. They put all their hopes on Piet Hein. They gave him a massive fleet of over 30 ships. His mission was clear: find the Spanish treasure fleet and capture it. The fate of the company rested on his shoulders. In the late summer of 1628, Piet Hein's fleet was waiting. They were hiding near the coast of Cuba, in a place called the Bay of Matanzas. They knew the Spanish treasure fleet had to pass this way on its journey back to Spain. It was the perfect spot for an ambush. For weeks, they waited. The sailors grew restless. The tension was immense. Hein had to keep his men disciplined and ready. Then, one morning, a lookout shouted from the mast. Ships were spotted on the horizon. It was them. The Spanish treasure fleet had arrived. The Spanish fleet was not expecting an attack. A hurricane had recently hit the area, and the fleet had been scattered. Their powerful galleon warships had been separated from the slower cargo ships. The Spanish admiral made a terrible mistake. Instead of sailing for the open sea, he led his ships into the narrow, shallow waters of the bay. He thought it would be a safe place to regroup. He was wrong. It was a trap. Piet Hein's ships were smaller and more maneuverable. They quickly blocked the entrance to the bay. The Spanish were trapped. What happened next was not a bloody battle. It was a surrender. The Spanish saw they were hopelessly cornered. Their big galleons were stuck in the mud. Hein's ships surrounded them, their cannons ready to fire. The Spanish admiral had no choice. He gave up without a fight. Piet Hein and his men boarded the Spanish ships. What they found was beyond their wildest dreams. The holds were packed with treasure. There was silver, gold, pearls, and expensive goods like indigo and cochineal dye. It was the entire wealth of the Spanish Americas for that year. The Dutch sailors could not believe their eyes. They had hit the jackpot. They spent days transferring the treasure from the Spanish ships to their own. It was a massive operation. The amount of silver was staggering. They had captured 16 Spanish ships. Piet Hein had done the impossible. He had pulled off the greatest heist in maritime history. He sailed back to the Netherlands not just as a rich man, but as a national hero. The news of his victory sent shockwaves across Europe. The Dutch were ecstatic. The Spanish were furious. Piet Hein's victory was a massive event, but it was just one part of a much larger war at sea. The Atlantic Ocean in the 17th century was a dangerous and violent place. The WIC's privateering was not a series of clean, easy captures. It was a brutal and bloody business. For every successful raid like the one at Matanzas Bay, there were countless smaller, desperate fights. Ships met on the open ocean and tore each other apart with cannon fire. These battles were terrifying. Wooden splinters flew through the air like bullets. The noise was deafening. The decks ran with blood. The WIC was not just fighting the Spanish, they were also at war with the Portuguese. At the time, Spain and Portugal were ruled by the same king. This meant that Portugal's rich colonies were also fair game. The WIC launched a huge invasion of Brazil, which was a Portuguese colony. They wanted to take control of the sugar plantations there. This led to decades of brutal fighting. The Dutch captured cities like Recife and Salvador, but they could never control the whole region. It was a long, draining war of ambushes, raids, and sieges. The sailors who fought in these wars lived a hard life. They were often at sea for months or even years at a time. The conditions on the ships were terrible. Food was often rotten and fresh water was scarce. Diseases like scurvy were common. And then there was the constant danger of battle. A sailor could be killed by a cannonball, a musket shot, or a swinging sword. If their ship was sunk, they could drown. If they were captured, they might be executed, or like the young Piet Hein, forced into slavery. It was a life of high risk for a small chance of high reward. This constant warfare was incredibly expensive. The WIC had to maintain a huge fleet of warships. They had to pay thousands of soldiers and sailors. They had to build and defend forts across the Atlantic. Even when they captured a prize, there were costs. The captured ship might be damaged, the cargo might be spoiled, and the treasure had to be shared. A large part went to the government and another large part went to the company's investors. The sailors who did the fighting often received only a small share. It was a business with very thin profit margins. The amount of treasure Piet Hein brought back was simply mind-boggling. When his fleet arrived in the Netherlands, it actually took days to unload all the silver. It was weighed and counted. The final value was estimated at around 11 million guilders. To put that into perspective, this was more than the entire cost of building the Dutch Navy for a year. It was honestly an astronomical sum of money. The WIC had been on the verge of collapse. Now, it was suddenly richer than it had ever been. The company was saved. Its future seemed bright. The money had a huge impact. First, the company paid its debts. Then, it paid its shareholders. The investors who had gambled on the WIC received a massive dividend. Some sources say it was as high as 50% of their original investment. People who had put money into the company became rich overnight. This created a huge buzz. Everyone wanted to invest in the WIC now. Its stock price soared. The capture of the treasure fleet seemed to prove that privateering was the best business model in the world. It was a get-rich-quick scheme that had actually worked. Piet Hein became the most famous man in the Netherlands. He was celebrated with parades and poems. He was the hero who had defeated the Spanish and brought home a mountain of silver. The victory was a huge boost to Dutch morale. It was a symbol of their strength and their defiance against the mighty Spanish Empire. The money also had a practical effect on the war. The 11 million guilders helped fund the Dutch army for months. This allowed them to launch a new offensive against the Spanish on land. The heist didn't just enrich a company, it changed the course of the war. However, this incredible success created a dangerous expectation. The WIC and its investors now believed that another huge prize was just around the corner. They thought they could repeat the success of 1628. They poured even more money into privateering fleets. They sent more ships to hunt for Spanish treasure. But the Spanish were not going to make the same mistake twice. They improved the security of their treasure fleets. They used better warships and more disciplined commanders. The heist of Matanzas Bay was a once-in-a-lifetime event. It could not be repeated. The massive profit from Piet Hein's raid created a serious problem for the Dutch West India Company. It made them greedy. The company became obsessed with the idea of privateering. They saw it as an easy path to wealth. Why bother with the slow, difficult work of building colonies and setting up trade routes? That took years and a lot of investment. Raiding Spanish ships seemed so much faster and more exciting. The lure of quick cash was just too strong. The company focused all its energy and resources on its military operations. This was a short-sighted strategy. It was like a farmer who decides to eat all his seeds instead of planting them. The WIC neglected the foundations of a lasting business. Building a successful colony required patience. It meant encouraging settlers to move there. It meant building towns and farms. It meant creating peaceful relationships with local peoples. It meant establishing stable, long-term trade. The WIC was not very good at any of this. Their colonies, like New Netherland in North America, where New York is today, were underfunded and poorly managed. Compare the WIC to its more famous sibling, the Dutch East India Company, or VOC. The VOC operated in Asia. It also had a military arm, but its main focus was trade. The WIC created a vast and incredibly profitable trading network that lasted for 2 centuries. They controlled the spice trade. They built a powerful and stable empire. They understood that long-term profit came from control over production and markets, not just from stealing. The WIC, by contrast, was always chasing the next big prize. It was living from one raid to the next. This focus on raiding made the WIC's fortunes very unstable. One year they might capture a few ships and make a small profit. The next year, they might find nothing and lose a lot of money. The company's income went up and down like a ship in a storm. This made it difficult to plan for the future. They were always reacting to events, rather than building a solid strategy. The quick cash from Piet Hein's heist was like a drug. It gave them a temporary high, but it distracted them from building a healthy, sustainable business for the long term. After the high of 1628, the WIC's luck began to run out. Piet Hein, the hero of the treasure fleet, was killed in battle the very next year, fighting pirates from Dunkirk. It was a huge blow to the company and the country. They had lost their most brilliant commander. The WIC continued to send out privateering fleets, but they never again came close to repeating the success of Matanzas Bay. The Spanish were now on high alert. The easy money was gone. The company had to face the harsh reality that its business model was not sustainable. The long and expensive war in Brazil was also draining the company's resources. For a while, the Dutch controlled a large part of the Brazilian coast, but the Portuguese settlers there never gave up fighting. They waged a guerrilla war against the Dutch. The WIC had to spend a fortune on soldiers and forts just to hold on to their territory. Eventually, it became too expensive. In 1654, the Dutch were finally driven out of Brazil. It was a humiliating defeat. The WIC had lost its most valuable colony and all the money it had invested there. The company's other colonial projects also struggled. New Netherland, their colony in North America, was a prime piece of real estate. It had the magnificent harbor of New Amsterdam, which we now call New York City. But the WIC never really invested in it. The colony grew very slowly. In 1664, during a war between the Netherlands and England, an English fleet sailed into the harbor. The colony surrendered without a fight. The WIC had lost another valuable asset. Its Atlantic empire was crumbling. The company was bleeding money. By the late 17th century, the WIC was a shadow of its former self. It had lost its main colonies and its main source of income. The great age of privateering was over. The wars with Spain and Portugal came to an end. The company tried to focus more on trade, particularly the horrific trade in enslaved Africans. But it was too little, too late. The company was deeply in debt. In 1674, the original Dutch West India Company was officially declared bankrupt. A new, smaller company was created, but it never achieved the power or notoriety of the original. The Great Pirate Company was finished. So, what should we make of the Dutch West India Company? It was a company born of war. It was designed to hurt Spain and make a profit at the same time. For a brief, glorious moment, it succeeded beyond anyone's imagination. The capture of the Spanish treasure fleet in 1628 was a legendary achievement. It made the company rich, it made Piet Hein a hero, and it helped the Dutch in their fight for independence. It was a story of daring, adventure, and incredible fortune. A story of pirates with paperwork who pulled off the perfect crime. But the story of the WIC is also a cautionary tale. It is a story about the dangers of chasing short-term glory instead of building long-term value. The company's obsession with privateering, with the quick thrill of the raid, was ultimately its undoing. While the Dutch East India Company was patiently building a trading empire that would last for centuries, the WIC was gambling everything on the next battle. This pirate's mentality brought them a mountain of silver once, but it could not sustain them in the long run. An empire cannot be built on theft alone. The legacy of the WIC is therefore complex. It is a symbol of Dutch power and ambition during their golden age. It shows how a small country could challenge a global superpower like Spain. But it is also a reminder of the brutal realities of the era. The company's wealth was built on violence. Its ships were instruments of war, and its operations included the brutal and inhumane transatlantic slave trade, which brought misery to millions. This is a dark and shameful part of its history that cannot be ignored. The treasure of the WIC was stained with blood. In the end, the pirates with paperwork were consumed by their own risky business. Their story shows us that a foundation built on violence and plunder is like a house built on sand. It may look impressive for a while, but eventually, the tide will come in and wash it all away. The WIC enjoyed a brief, shining moment of success, but its failure to build something lasting, something sustainable, is its most important lesson. The glamour of the pirate's life is exciting in stories, but in the real world of business and empire, it is a path to ruin.